Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of AOI, proud members of AOI of DC, Washington's oldest and most distinguished civic organization. Welcome to our April luncheon. Hope you're enjoying the good company and the good food. And we're very privileged today to have Pat Burke, President of the DC Police Foundation, who will be talking to us, and he'll be introduced shortly. And now, I'm always happy to see members here. Do we have any guests today? Has anyone come to join us? Please stand and be acknowledged.
Shelley Livingston and my husband, Gil Livingston.
Thank you very much, Gil and Shelley. Great. Here. The more the better. That's right. Any other guests today? Good. Welcome. We're happy to have you. Great. Okay. Well, let me say, as I do at every meeting, we are delighted to have the use of this superb facility. I know back in our hearts, we have nostalgic memories of the Channel Inn and some not so nostalgic memories of the Capitol skyline. But we were so fortunate after the pandemic that we were able to be welcome to use this magnificent facility. And for our members, yes, thanks to the Women's National Democratic Club. And to our members who are watching on the video online, and to our members who aren't here, I sure would like to see a few more tables filled. I mean, it's an easy place to get to, well served by public transportation if you can use public transportation. We do have parking in the garage across the street. So tell your friends who are members that with delicious food. This is the best we've ever had. So let's see if we can get our in-person turnout a little higher. I'd be happy to see that. Just a few points. We're still waiting today for the date on which the 16th Street World War I memorial tree, Bill?
May 30th.
Okay, Bill tells me it's May 30th.
Monday, May 30th. Can I just scream it out?
Sure.
Okay, for the dedication of the plaque for the 16th Street Tree War Memorial, Monday, May 30th, which is Memorial Day, holiday, no parking restrictions, although the buses might run less frequently. 1 o'clock in the afternoon at the corner intersection of 16th and Alaska Avenue, 16th and Alaska, right behind Walter Reed's old gate. There's a great big huge segment of sidewalk there. Our plaque's been installed. It will be unveiled officially on that date. There are no comfort facilities. There are no seats, okay, because we expect the event to last no more than 30 minutes. But it's accessible by bus, and like I said, there's plenty of parking there, and we will send out invitations to the membership and all, probably online with maybe a postcard to the people that don't participate online. So Memorial Day, May 30th, rain or shine, 1 o'clock, 16th and Alaska Avenue.
Thanks, Bill. And let me remind everybody, Memorial Day this year actually falls on Memorial Day, which is a fairly rare occurrence, or Decoration Day, as we used to call it. And again, with respect to the 16th Street Memorial, again, gratitude and thanks to Barbara Bates for her really tireless efforts in this project to make sure that it was accomplished, and finally it will come to pass. And it's a feather in her cap, and it is a credit to this organization. Now, also, I'm happy to say that the gravestone for World War I veteran Bertha Ryan Hayes has now been placed in Congressional Cemetery. And this is one of several gravestones that AOI worked very hard for. Maggie Hobbs was instrumental in that. I don't see Maggie here today, but in recognizing women who served in services in World War I, but didn't make the cut. They were in auxiliary or ancillary services, but we felt that they should be honored. And Bill, which group approves those monuments? Is it the?
Is this the one for the congressional? Or, the Veterans Administration gave Maggie a fit over documenting the 4 unmarked, unacknowledged graves of the nurses. I'm sorry. Do we really want to hear this whole story? So anyhow, Maggie fought for a couple of years. There were 4 nurses out of, and they weren't all nurses. Some of them were Navy Reserve officers. I've forgotten the term. You caught me off guard. But anyhow, she fought with the VA for a couple of years. They approved one, which they provided the traditional VA stone for at Mount Olivet. They would not acknowledge or approve stones for the other 3. 2 of them at Congressional were completely unmarked graves, so AOI purchased in-stone granite markers for those 2 ladies, and the 4th person was actually acknowledged with a headstone. She was buried with her brother, but there was no acknowledgement of her service in the Navy, so AOI had a bronze plaque fabricated to be installed in front of their headstone, and I believe, fingers crossed, it was dropped off to them a few weeks ago, and they said that they would send me a photo when it was installed. Well, I haven't gotten a photo yet, but we said we'd like to do an official unveiling of all 3 of those, perhaps on Veterans Day. That gives us plenty of time to get down the road, make sure they're installed, get everything else out of the way. So, Maggie and Barbara, based on Barbara's research, Maggie fought long and hard to try to get these acknowledged. She was successful in the one, and then we filled in the blanks with the other 3.
Thanks.
Is that helpful?
That's helpful. It's very interesting and a good thing for us to do. Now, I'll move on. I will entertain a motion to waive the reading of the minutes of the March 17 meeting unless somebody really wants to hear them. Do I hear a motion? Okay, motion to waive. Second? Second? All in favor? Aye. The ayes appear to have it. Next on the agenda, our treasurer's report. Carolyn, would you kindly step up here?
Okay, good afternoon. So, let's see. We have, to date, 219 renewals that have been sent in. So our total for dues is $43.80, donations $8,270, and if you'd like to know what are the money that you send in goes to, the aforementioned markers and the newsletter that we sent out, $783 for the newsletter, $5.5 for the 16th Street Memorial, and I think it was about, I didn't write it down, I think about $400 for the marker. The plaques.
Yeah, 286, I think it was.
Yeah, so we're well on track to cover through our donations and dues to cover our projected expenses this year, but we still need those that have not renewed to send in the renewals. So we'll be calling on those that haven't to remind them. And I think that's it.
Do we need a motion to accept the treasurer's report? I can't recall on that. So moved. Seconded?
I'll second.
Seconded. All in favor? Aye. Okay. And I noticed something just the other day. It came quite as a surprise to me. As I was driving on Independence Avenue on my way into the office, on the left side, on the north side of the avenue, between the Korean War Memorial and the D.C. War Memorial, the Park Service has quite a large structure under construction, which I usually keep up on these things, but I had not any information, and it is their new stables, paddock, and an educational center. Now, it's kind of close to the D.C. War Memorial, but from what I can see, it won't infringe on it. And this, thank you very much, Cindy. This is an architect's conception of part of the new building, which is now under construction. And it will include new stalls and paddocks for the horses and, as I said, educational facilities for the visitors, because if you know, the foot traffic along that part of the mall, along Independence Avenue, is really pretty heavy, and it'll be nice for people to come in and take a look at what the Park Service is doing. So that is underway, and it looks from the drawings like it will be an addition to the landscape. It will certainly be an improvement over what has been there. The current stables and paddock were built in 1976 as a temporary measure for the bicentennial. So that was what, 45 years ago, 46 years ago? And as we all know, as all Washingtonians know, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary federal building. So we welcome this new addition to our neighborhood on the mall and thank the Park Service for this and wish them well with their new facility. And thanks to Cindy for getting this up for me. So as I say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Questions? Sure. Yeah, Cindy, can you give us a roll call or a sense of how many people are with you today?
We have about let's find. We have about 15 people who are joining us online over Zoom. Could you hear that? Okay, can you see that? That's what we got, about 15 people. I'm sorry, is this still on me? Is there anything else I can give you?
Yeah, thanks, folks. We were happy to have you with us, and we hope that you will consider coming and joining us here in person at some point when it's convenient for you. Now, also, yes.
One other thing, all these plaques and things reminded me, some years back, maybe about 8 years ago, Congress decided to give the Civil Air Patrol people from World War II, I think a Congressional Gold Medal or something. And so we had a relative who's been dead for 41 years, but we're arranging to have it presented to the family. So if anyone else has anybody in their family that was in the Civil Air Patrol, they'll arrange, I don't know, a cousin's taking care of it, but anyway, they'll arrange for a ceremony and a medal and all that stuff for the families.
Okay, thank you very much. Good to know. Now, also, we have some unfinished business with respect to our new members. In our eagerness to welcome new members, in recent times we've neglected to propose them for approval by the association, which is required by the bylaws. Such an exclusive group. So at this time, Carolyn, our treasurer, will read the names of all the candidates for membership proposed since the last time that we took a vote. And I urge you to vote yes on all these.
Thank you, Tom. Before I read the names of the members that have already been announced, we've had some new members join since the last meeting. Let's see here. Andrea Seeger, she's a tour guide and author of 111 Places in Washington, D.C. that you must not miss the guidebook. She joined the day of the last meeting, the last luncheon.
Welcome.
Melissa Klopfer, a longtime DC resident, retired educator, descendant of Christian, Benjamin, and Russell Klopfer. She found out about AOI from her great-grandfather's obituary when she was doing her genealogy. So her great-grandfather Benjamin was admitted to the AOI in 1906. So wanted to make a, yeah. So then we have Ann Sellen. She's retired, lived and worked in DC for over 20 years, referred by Charles Robertson. Let's see, Kirby Vining. We've awarded him a complimentary membership. He's the president of the Committee of 100 of DC. Christopher Oliphant, 7th generation Washingtonian, firefighter, technician for the DCFD, found out about AOI through Firefighters Association. And now I'll read the names of the people who have joined since January. Colby King from the Washington Post, Anna Fierce, former president of the Women's National Democratic Committee, George Farr, our Cynthia Guiley's father-in-law, Valerie Grant, Helen Gleason White, Tim Hannipol, former classmate from Wilson High School, which is now the Jackson Reed High School, Joseph Spilsbury, Kimberly Bender of the Herrick House, who's now our general counsel, Sasha Kay, Andrea Sager, and that's it. So, motion to approve the new members?
We will entertain a motion to approve these candidates for membership in AOI of DC. So moved. Second? Second. All in favor of approving these new members? Aye. The ayes appear to have it. Thank you very much. Well, Nelson's not here today. Oh, that's right. Yes, they are in Arizona. I'd forgotten that. They're lucky. No quiz. I've been thinking of putting one together, but I haven't finished. Things are like streets, the names of which have changed in Washington, D.C. over the years, because a lot of them have, interestingly enough. Did I see Bill Rice raise his hand there?
Yeah, Nelson is traveling out of town, getting ready for his campaign for delegate to Congress.
Oh, Nelson is a perennial candidate for political office. He is campaigning for the Republican nomination, I suspect.
He has the Republican nomination, I think.
For D.C. delegate to Congress. Well, Nelson, we wish you good luck, but we won't approve or not approve you. We're not a political organization. So now it's my pleasure to have our principal speaker join us today, and that's Patrick Burke, who is president of the D.C. Police Foundation. He will discuss the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Memorial and Museum. And Bill, would you please do the honors on this?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. So I figure and know that AOI members like reminiscing, like chronologies, like timelines, like stories. So my introduction of actually our two guest speakers is going to be a little bit different today. So I'm going to do this chronologically and hope you all bear with me a second. Chief Ernest Brown, who was the Metropolitan Police Department's chief from 1932 to 1942, or so I think we agreed, was one of the first, if not the first, chief to rise through the ranks and not be appointed from a military position or whatever. He was a vice president of the Association of the Oldest Inhabitants of D.C. When he retired, he lived up in Shepherd Park, We actually have records of a thank you note from Chief Brown to us when AOI had sent him flowers on the occasion of something in our files. Camp Ernest Brown down in Scotland, Maryland, which I don't think is a Boys and Girl Scout camp anymore, but for many years served kids for the summers and all at Camp Ernest Brown. And he originated the then Police Boys Club, which is now the Police Boys and Girls Club, Ernest W. Brown. And then if any of you were around long enough, you know I channeled and interpreted Ernest Brown as a beat cop from 1896 in my Georgetown walking tours, but that's another story. Ernest Brown, no relation to Bill Brown, just a coincidence. So anyhow, there you have Ernest Brown back 1932, 42, his affiliation with AOI. October 20th, 2000, we're at the Channel Inn. I'm a deputy chief with the Fairfax County Police Department at the time, and we decided we should do something about law enforcement history in D.C. And on that day, that Friday afternoon, we had Metropolitan Police Chief Chuck Ramsey and U.S. Park Police Chief Lynn Herring and U.S. Capitol Police Chief Robert Langdon, all as panelists talking about the history of their three departments. That was in 2020. The pages sort of fall off the calendar and all, and in 2004, which was the first year that AOI dusted off their 1908 pumper for the fire department. It wasn't our pumper, we were just the custodians of it, and had it in the Palisades Parade. Remember now, this was July 4th, 2004. I was retired, I was doing stuff with the Park Service and all. I was just a neighbor organizing AOI's pumper in the parade. And the parade was kicked off in a marked DC police car led by an official with the DC Police Department, which I don't recall his rank at the time, but it might have been only as a lieutenant, 2004, I can't be sure. But it was one of our guest speakers today, Pat Burke, who lived in the Palisades, and he would lead off the parade with his then school-aged children waving and all from the front and back seats of the car, if I recall these days correctly. His kids were maybe in upper elementary school, not quite junior high school. They were quite young. That's 2004. In 2011, I was asked to put together a panel for the Historical Studies Conference, and I wanted to do something on the history of law enforcement. It happened to be the 150th anniversary of the Metropolitan Police Department. So I hooked up with our other guest speaker today, then Lieutenant Nick Bruel, who was the ex officio, unofficial, custodian, historian, keeper of all things historic at the Metropolitan Police Department, because like so many places, the agency didn't put much into preserving their history and records and all, but Nick and his successors did a lot with what they had. So anyhow, Nick and Sandy Schmidt and 2 or 3 other people, were panelists talking about the history of MPDC. Sandy had talked about the lives of African-American officers. Someone else spoke on the relationship about the first MPDC officer killed. It was a fascinating thing. So that was in 2011. So in the spring of 2022, here we are. We've got our guest speakers today, Patrick Burke, who's now the retired Assistant Chief of Police with the Metropolitan Police Department and President of the DC Police Foundation. Okay, he's going to be a speaker. And here we are with Nick Bruel, who's a retired lieutenant. And Nick is spending his time these days doing officer safety research and all for the National Police Memorial and Museum. Say I got my titles right. So he's doing a lot of research on officer deaths and casualties and all, but also using that, and he might address this, in improving conditions for law enforcement, in their day-to-day routines, in a training session, in a training so that they don't, suffer, the demise. So it's kind of interesting that over all those years, we've sort of woven all this stuff together. We've got neighbors, we've got past presenters, we've got people that were impersonating past police chiefs, all here today, and the 2 of them are going to tell you about the DC Police Foundation and the DC Police Memorial and Museum fundraising efforts and what they plan for Daly Plaza down in front of on Indiana Avenue in front of the Daly Building. So Pat and Nick, please, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bill. Good to see some friendly faces, and so happy to be here with you today. Nick is going to walk you through some slides in just a little bit. I want to talk about my background and a little bit about DC Police, where we were and where we are now. I actually came here out of Western New York, born and raised in Rochester, New York, went to college and graduate school in Buffalo, and joined the Metropolitan Police Department at the height of our crack epidemic in 1989. So busy days. I worked as a midnight officer in Anacostia and learned a lot, as Nick knew, in the early days as well. But great experience. I did 27 years with MPD, a lot of my time in Special Operations Division. And as far as history goes, I was the first Homeland Security Chief in DC Police history, right? Pre-9/11, we didn't need Homeland Security, so I oversaw intelligence and special operations, which was kind of the fun part: helicopter, harbor, SWAT teams, traffic division, except for the traffic tickets, the photo enforcement that you may receive. You might not like that as much, but a lot of the toys of the police department that I'm still very active with. In 2016, after serving as the Homeland Security Chief and then subsequently the Strategic Services Chief, where I saw a lot of technology within the department, and testing and some recruiting, training, some other branches, I retired to go work for President Obama as the U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. And I understand you do a little trivia, but your trivia person isn't here today. So I've got a trivia question for you that relates to Rochester, New York, and ties it all together. And who was the first African American to you've got it right, but now finish the question, because there's a few things. He moved to Rochester, where actually he hosted John Brown before the Harper's Ferry raid. He was also the first African American to receive a presidential vote in 1888. He was also the first African American appointed as a U.S. Marshal to Washington, D.C., and consequently the ambassador to Haiti. So I thought it was kind of cool, and he's actually buried at Good Hope Cemetery not far from my house in Rochester, New York. So it's kind of cool that he was the first African American, and I was able to serve the first African American president. So a little Rochester link, which is good. Nick, can you pass that? This is our inaugural patch for this past year that we had specially made. Can you pass that over for me? Thanks so much. So very good on your Frederick Douglass trivia. We grew up watching Frederick Douglass. She gets this wonderful special edition patch. Don't worry, there's a few other things that we can think of. So anyway, after working for Chief Lanier, she left MPD, of course, to go. She's the first female security director of the NFL, and doing well there. A few of our friends went to work with her also. When Chief Newsham took over, he asked me to leave. Trump had just taken office, and he asked me to resign from the Marshal Service to take over at the DC Police Foundation. And I love the Marshals. 1789, very old federal agency. Does anybody know who named the first 13 U.S. Marshals?
Abraham Lincoln.
Little before then, but George Washington. Nick, can you pass the special January 6th coin to right there? So George Washington, 1789, started the U.S. Marshal Service. George Washington knew all 13 marshals from the Revolutionary War and appointed them to serve, to assist the judges. When you think about forming a posse, a lot hasn't changed with the Marshal Service. Now it's just called the Fugitive Task Force that we ran in D.C. So it's interesting how a lot of things, when you think of Clint Eastwood in the cowboy days, the marshals would round up people, your friends, and you go out and get the bad guys. So it was interesting to see that. So within the Police Foundation, a lot of the work that I do, and interestingly, our current chief, Bob Conti, who lives down the road from us on MacArthur Boulevard in the Palisades, worked for me in the 2nd District as a sergeant, worked for me as a captain, and then when I ran recruiting, he was my commander there too. So it's good to see him, and he's a wonderful person. Department-wise, and the chief is a wonderful person. He's into his first year. We're, as you can see, if you watch the news on a daily basis, struggling with crime a little bit right now. I hate to say it. After having so many great years, right now, this year, robberies are up 51%, homicides close to it, but we've crept up a little bit in those areas, so that there's some concerning challenges there. Our staffing is down about 500 officers in DC. 1 year of defunding MPD by $15 million, we lost about 500 cops. And retire, resignations, so it's difficult. You know, the joy we have of MPD is we can recruit nationally. We hire about 1 out of every 27 applicants, so we have pretty high standards when you think about polygraph and some of the other standards to get on, but it's expensive to live here. We're down to, I think, about 22% of police officers live in the city. They can't afford to live in the city. So we're working with council really on incentives. I bought my first house in Georgetown through the HPAP program, which helped to keep me in the city. So it was wonderful. But a lot of work to do there. Those little kids that Bill talked about before, my 4 kids, Our Lady of Victory, St. John's Visitation, my son, my 22-year-old son, Knucklehead, is now a cop working midnights in the 3rd District too. So interesting how it happens. But I was a knucklehead back then too. It all comes along. So it's great to be here once again. The work I do with Chief Conti and the foundation is supporting our officers and really working to keep minority youth out of the prison system. I run their police athletic league. Really, I don't run it. I make money for the police department, or I ask people for money. The officers do all the work. They coach kids, they mentor kids, whether it's sports, academics, you name it. We've got a wonderful police department. It's a diverse police department. We're a minority-majority police department. We're working the chief's current incentive to get to 30% women. I think we're 23% and amongst the highest in the country. It's important. If you look at the LGBT community, we're gay, we're transgender, we're Muslim, we're Jewish. We cover everybody. And DC's an international city, so I think the chief's doing a great job to cover that as well. So the other group that I work with beyond the DC Police Foundation is, and Nick and I are both on the board with the DC Police Memorial and Museum. History is so important. I was telling Bill, I just found out recently, we have a house in Georgetown, and some university students came by, and they were doing some research. They're looking at the slave history in Georgetown, and our house, which was built in 1904, was a former slave pen. 6 houses in a row that were torn down by Henry Copperhite of the Copperhite Pie Company, Connecticut Pie Company, and built houses. And potentially a police station that we're researching as well. So it's kind of interesting to see how that plays. But fortunately, in my young career, I met this wonderful guy named Nick Bruel. And Nick is one of those people who loves history. He's got 1 million stories, researched the chiefs, and we need to keep him alive for a long time so we can tap him for all this information. But a group of us came together and we said, you know what, we really need to do more to recognize and maintain the history of the DC Police Departments, the good, the bads, and the uglies, because we've had some uglies as well. So Nick and I and our board has worked to raise money, which we're currently doing, to build a DC Police Memorial, which will list all of our fallen officers with their names and histories in front of the Daly Building at 300 Indiana Avenue, and essentially create a memorial park. We're also working with MPD and Chief Conti as a legacy project to build a DC Police Museum inside of headquarters that we'll maintain as well. So we're very excited about that, and I'm going to turn it over to Nick now, and Nick, you can go through the slides and roll people through it and share your story.
Before you step down,
Yes.
entertain my question.
Sure.
Okay, it's
I thought you were asking for another trivia question. I didn't know, but that's okay.
No, I'm not very good at it, as you know. My question is, and it may be a little bit sort of out of bounds, but
That's okay.
I am so concerned about the increase in gun violence in our city.
Sure.
And I kind of want to know what the foundation may be doing to advocate for common sense gun laws, such as background checks. Because one of the things that I know the police face are a lot of people who have guns, and they are often the victims of it, but more often it's violence against and people in communities
And you know, that's a great question. Really, since I joined in 1989, I think we were close to 500 homicides. My rookie year, 492. And sadly, I think people become numb to gun violence a little bit. I think we're at 58 homicides this year already. You know what really hurts me? There was my son's beat is up in Mount Pleasant in the 3rd District. And there was a 15-year-old kid killed last week in the 1300 block of Columbia Road, and it gets a blurb. You know what got a big story, and it keeps running? 2 dogs that are dog-napped. I mean, there's a carjacking, but you know what? That's a human life. And that's a real challenge. But as you know, DC has very strict gun laws. And if you've seen, one of the things that I like the mayor did recently, and really if you look at the evolution of policing, and I teach graduate school at Georgetown in their applied intelligence division, and we look at really the history of policing from really CompStat, early evolution to CompStat, how that shook things up in New York and how police adapted to that. But really I think we've evolved from CompStat, which is to some extent putting cops on dots, the crimes in these areas, let's put more cops there, aggressively enforce, and there's negative consequences there as well, but to really focusing on the violent gun offenders. We know who these people are. If there's 200 people that are most prone to be a recidivist gun offender or commit violent crime, we need to focus on them. If they're out of jail with resources, how are we working to get them jobs, keeping them out of trouble? And the mayor's press conference, I think 2 days ago, talked about mentoring these people, and I forget the specific name for it, but it's a lot of work to engage in high-intensity supervision, whether it's ankle monitors. And interestingly, one of the technologies that we have in the police department is called Veritrax. So if somebody gets robbed or there's a murder that happens in the 1700 block of Connecticut Avenue, we'll pull up Veritrax, and sure enough, somebody's got an ankle monitor in that area. Robberies, you name it. So even being under supervision doesn't necessarily prevent somebody from hurting another person. But we do have very strict gun control laws in DC. We need to hold violent people accountable. And the chief will say that over and over again. If it's nonviolent drug offenses, so be it. We can work on alternatives to prison. We incarcerate a lot of people. DC police, we lock up a lot of people. We've got to look at the legislation and see how we're conducting our business. Are there other things we can do, citation people, et cetera? But we need to hold violent criminals accountable. And if there's somebody that's that violent,
And Congress
yep.
for allowing guns to be on the streets in many communities. The police who suffer from this as well need to step up and hold Congress accountable.
Right.
And that's not being done as far as I can see.
The NRA.
Senate.
Yeah.
Lobbyists for the NRA are rampant.
Sorry?
The lobbyists for the NRA are rampant, and that's why.
It is a challenge, and when you think about, you know, the sheer volume of weapons, over 350 million guns that are already out there. So you know what the reality for us, and Nick knows, as we transition from revolvers to Glocks, semi-automatic weapons, to now the proliferation of active shooter scenes where we've got officers carrying M4s or AR-15s in their trunks. We don't want to be overt with that, but we've got access to that. The challenge is we are facing heavier firepower on the street. So that is a challenge, but something, obviously, I, as a person who has been shot at and being concerned for my son, we're very concerned about gun safety and really pushing to get, and I know it's a higher level with Second Amendment rights, but we really do, and the chief puts great emphasis on getting illegal guns off the street.
Second Amendment rights
Right.
allow people to have muskets.
Right. Yep. But before, let's take one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nick to talk about the museum. Yep.
Move on with our program.
Okay.
We will have time for questions and answers,
Okay.
policy related, afterwards.
Okay, but Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about the museum.
All right. We pop up that first slide, please. Just a quick background on me. I did grow up in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Spring Valley. And my father was an Episcopal minister for St. Thomas's, which is right down the street. And in the 70s, we moved right up, I'm probably pointing the wrong way, to 19th Street. So I literally grew up here on DuPont Circle. I also did some undercovers down here in DuPont Circle, which that's the book I'm going to write. Oh, God. Is that right? Yeah, you did sell me that 8-ball no, I'm kidding. I had a wonderful career on MPD. I started in 1987, and as has already been mentioned, I retired as a lieutenant. And in that career arc, I went from patrol, I was a detective, I then got promoted to sergeant and, kind of worked the streets in all kinds of different areas of the city. I was then pulled into homicide against my will and did about 3 years in homicide, and then I was on what was called the Force Investigation Team, which was a highly elite group of investigators who started investigating police shootings after, if any of you remember, the 1998 Washington Post series on MPD's failure to adequately follow up and investigate some of these shootings. So I was on the Force Investigation Team for, I guess, about almost 8 years, and then got promoted to lieutenant, and Chief Lanier then sort of tapped me to go to different units that needed a little fixing. So I was shot up to the PIO office for a little bit when a bunch of people retired there, and then I was sent to communications, and then she finally gave me some time to write a history book on the history of the Metropolitan Police Department that had a yearbook component. Anyway, before I retired, a retiree by the name of Don Blake, who's a member of the Intelligence Division, but he retired in the 80s, had approached the department about fixing our fountain. And if you're familiar with the, if we can have the next slide, if you're familiar with this fountain that sits in front of 300 Indiana Avenue, and most people are not, that's part of our problem. And there are members of the Metropolitan Police Department that don't know that that was dedicated to the Metropolitan Police Department in 1942. So Don Blake, when he and his wife were walking by that fountain, looking much as it does there, and I have some more, there's a couple of more images of it, it had trash in it, and it had water that was dirty in it, and all of the plaques had been taken away, and if you can see, some people had come along and tried to fix it with mortar. This is the Metropolitan Police's only memorial, and we have 124 line-of-duty deaths. Now, everyone says, well, just go to the National. It's right around the corner. Your names are there. Yeah, our names are there among 22,000 other names. So that's not sufficient. Next slide, please. There it says Police Memorial right there in that wonderful tile. This was made by a group of actually Masons, I'm not sure what the right word would be, who made it, but they're still alive. The family that did this is still alive and still in D.C. And you see there's a lot of dirt in the water, and it's supposed to be a running fountain, which every year the department holds a memorial service there, and what we do is we literally put Tidy Bowl in it to make it blue and turn the water on, so it looks pretty. That's not sufficient. Next slide. So this is what we want to do with that space. And we have the cooperation and assistance of Donald Graham. Many of you may know who he is. You should know who he is. And he was the former chairman of the Washington Post, but he was also a D.C. police officer. Donald Graham was a D.C. police officer for 2 years and served in the 9th Precinct. And he is very fond of MPD and actually said to me when I took him on a ride-along one day back in the 2000s, and he really enjoyed it. And, he said, if I didn't have this job, I would have stayed as a policeman. And he really, really enjoyed it. So this is our concept. And if you see, obviously the fountain's going to be running, which will be a nice touch. It'll be cleaned up and fixed. And then we're going to put a slow arcing wall that people see our members' names on the wall. I don't know if any of you remember Shirley Gibson. She just passed away last year. Her son, Brian Gibson, was shot and killed in 1997, sitting in his patrol car at on Missouri Avenue, right just south of the 4th District Station. He was murdered because the man who shot him had just been kicked out of a club by another police officer. Shirley Gibson eloquently spoke about the need for survivors and for family members of D.C. police officers to have a place to go. Next slide. So that is part of our fundraising effort, and another adjunct to what we're doing, as Pat already mentioned, is back in 1994, I went down to this, if anybody remembers in 94 when we were struggling on the DC Police Department to get the oil changed in our cruisers, to get paper for our printers. The bond rating for the city was the lowest I think it had ever been. Resources were very scarce. We suffered a 13% pay cut. I went down to get our allotment of paper, and I looked, and there was this collection of stuff that was put and pushed into a corner. We had a motorcycle that was on its side. The items were clearly not being cared for, and I took it upon myself to start caring for those items. And I, over the next 15 years of my career, literally took over an old telephone closet on the 5th floor and put a lock on it and started putting things in there so they wouldn't disappear. We then, under Chief Ramsey, had a museum that was on the 6th floor where communications used to be, and unfortunately that building, 300 Avenue, is like a sieve. It leaks all over the place, unfortunately, even in the chief's office. So now they're all over in 441. If you're not aware of that, virtually everything is moved out of 300 Indiana Avenue and is now over at the, I guess, is it 1 Judiciary Square or 441? 441. For the Metropolitan Police Department, the 300 Indiana Avenue means a lot because if you recall, 1994 in November, 2 FBI agents and Hank Daly were shot and killed when a man who was about to be arrested for homicide went into that building, found his way up to homicide, and opened fire in the cold case squad room. So for us, that building means a lot. And it's been our headquarters since the cornerstone's laid in 41, but by 42, I think our building was there, and a lot of Metropolitan Police units were housed there right up until just last year. But this is some of the things that I've tucked away, and we've already got space in 441 assigned to us to put this stuff in, and I have to speak to the chief's commitment to this because when Chief Conti was a lieutenant, he was assigned to go with myself and another officer to tour locally and regionally to other police agencies who have museums. So the New Jersey State Police have a museum. They have the ladder from the Lindbergh kidnapping there on display. They have people who study that because a lot of people write about that case. If you will go to Delaware, the Delaware State Police, which is in Wilmington, Delaware, where it used to be all the credit card companies were there. Anyway, they had an amazing museum with like one of every single type of car they ever had there. I mean, it was incredible. And we went to Maryland State and looked at theirs, and we traveled to a couple of others, and we talked to Chicago and talked to New York. So Chief Conti was involved in that initial historic project to pull stuff together and to see how we could build our own museum. I won't go through each item, but some of the older items, if you see that clacker down there, that's our oldest item. That's from 1857. Those handcuffs are from 1883, and when I found them, they were marked with a tag on them, and it said that these were the handcuffs used on Charles Guiteau, who shot President Garfield. I'll talk about that in a minute. We do have several older uniforms. We have an old police blotter, and then thanks to the efforts and the support from the chiefs that we got, a lot of items, cops like to collect things, right? We all like to have pieces of history. A lot of items, such as some logbooks that recorded the assassination of President Lincoln, have found their way back to the police department. So, and we've spoken to the National Archives about that. I think we're okay. Next slide, please. Oops, if you can go back. Yeah, if you can go back one. There we go. So a little quick history on the Metropolitan Police Department. Abraham Lincoln actually presided over the very first Board of Police Commissioners meeting. He was responsible for sending a man named Zenas Robbins up to New York to study the New York police system that had already been established. And of course, the New York police system was based on Sir Robert Peel's system that they were using in London. So we're sort of descended from that police system. These are some of the earliest photographs of officers and what their uniforms would have looked like in 1861. William B. Webb was the first major and superintendent. The rank of chief of police didn't come along until, I think, around, although they could be referred to as chief, the actual title was major and superintendent, and the rank of chief didn't really get adopted until around 1910. Although some people continue to refer to the office as major and superintendent. And as you see there are 150 men initially assigned with 10 precincts with a sergeant in charge of each precinct. Next slide, please. So stepping into national history, one of the reasons I show that picture of the Capitol and that badge, our badge has not changed since 1861. The badges were made before the Capitol was complete. So it was a little unusual. And if you're familiar, I have President Lincoln's photo there, but I really should have put Grant's photo because there's an African-American policeman sitting in that photograph there by the name of William West. Little trivia. Does anybody know what William West did? He arrested President Grant as a sitting president while speeding in a buggy. It's a true story. And the president was forced to go to the precinct, pay the fine, and walk back to the White House. It's a true story. And that was President Grant's second or third arrest for what was called fast driving. Now, not when he was a sitting president, only once when he was a sitting president. But now we have cameras, right? We have speed enforcement cameras, right? But William West and Grant famously told him to do your duty. And because I think that the Officer West was like, whoop, 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 okay, go ahead, sir. He made him do his duty, and he did it. And so we've actually been contacted about some folks who want to put a plaque in the 3rd District, which at the time covered the area where the traffic stop was made by that officer. Next slide, please. So again, I mentioned Garfield and the piece of history that we do have in the Metropolitan Police Museum. But what a lot of people don't realize is that, of course, you can, if you're good with your history, you know the story of Robert Todd Lincoln also being there. And then also Robert Todd Lincoln about to get off a train in Buffalo when McKinley shot, and after that he swore off visiting sitting presidents. Patrolman Patrick Kearney, a recent immigrant to the United States who served in the Civil War, was there in the, which I believe was referred to as the Potomac and Baltimore and Potomac Depot, Railroad Depot, which is where the National Art Gallery is now, and was there to immediately arrest Guiteau. So Private Patrick Kearney immediately arrested him after he was shot. And just quickly, you know, Garfield lingered for a long time. Garfield went back up to New Jersey. Edison famously tried to use a metal detector to detect the bullet in the president, and they think the bed springs were throwing it off, that his technology may have actually worked, so they could have removed the bullet. Ultimately, President Garfield succumbed to his gunshot wound. Next slide. So MPD is always on the spotlight. We're the police department of the nation's capital. Yeah, there are a lot of other police agencies here in Washington, D.C. A lot. 13 that can write moving violations, if you can believe that. 13. Zoo Police, I think, can write moving violations. But with these photos, I want to illustrate we're one of the first agencies to put women in uniform patrol. And the woman on the left with the notebook, her name is Marilyn Hershey. She retired as an inspector from the Metropolitan Police Department. She's still around, but she was one of the very first women to get into uniform and actually patrol in what we call scout cars. The term scout car referred to the military reconnaissance sort of vehicle, and the Metropolitan Police Department developed it following the Detroit Police Department, who refer to their patrol vehicles as scout cars. The next photo, and these are not in historic sequence, is Pelham Glassford. He was a chief of police or superintendent of police who patrolled on a motorcycle. Very unusual. He's a World War I brigadier general. And if you know the story of the bonus army that came to Washington during the Depression to try and get their promised World War I bonuses, he worked very well in organizing them and in keeping the peace until finally they were ordered to be dispersed, and there was a great deal of rioting. A lot of policemen were injured, and there was actually one shooting. But Pelham Glassford, as the brigadier general, was able to really keep a lid on a lot of that, help the men get organized, and really manage the situation very well until it was sort of taken out of his hands. On the right, if you're not familiar with that photo at the top, that is Chief Morris Cullinane. Now, he was an officer when that Pulitzer Prize-winning photo was taken in 1957, and it was at the Chinese New Year on H Street, and he was admonishing the little boy to get back because they were throwing firecrackers. But that is, if you go to, well, the museum is closed now, sorry to say, but that photo is in the collection of the Pulitzer Prize-winning photos of the museum. And then down on the bottom are officers lined up for inspection with Teddy Roosevelt's kids standing there right down next to them. Next slide. I put this in here just because it's cool. You know, we patrol the Potomac as well, and back in the 1880s, we actually got a steamboat to patrol the Potomac, and we have a harbor branch. And I just love that picture with the two guys there, and just to remind everybody that we don't just have the streets, we have the waterways. Next slide. So we have a lot of interesting history on the Metropolitan Police Department, and you may not know it, but in 1949, there was a train robbery that started in West Virginia. They literally took over a train with the conductor, two drunk guys, robbed everybody on the train, forced the train off to a siding, got out, stole a car, and drove to Washington, D.C. Police tracked the stolen car, and there was a shootout in a pawn shop. And this is a picture of all the officers and the detectives getting their notes together following the arrest, the shooting of one of them and the arrest of the other guy. It's a fascinating story. And it was a B&O Railroad passenger train that was robbed. And I say it's the last train robbery in the United States. I don't know if that's true or not. And if you remember the transit strike, in 1955, we had all of the streetcars. The streetcar operators went on strike, and so people were driving into the district, and the Metropolitan Police Department coordinated parking along the tracks at an angle all along Pennsylvania Avenue, any of the major avenues, and it was very hot during that summer. So during the transit strike, the chief made the decision, and it's the first time, to allow officers to wear short-sleeve shirts. And that's big. And that's why he's there. You can see he's kind of feeling the heat in that picture. Next picture, please. Next slide, please. Watergate. Okay, I saw on your website that Paul Leeper's going to come speak, or has already spoken. I'm not. Oh, he did? Oh, has spoken. Okay, well, yeah, I knew. I talked to Paul a couple of times, and I've heard the story. It's a great story. That is a photo of a little display we had up on the 5th floor of headquarters. That is the arrest book that has the names, which are not the real names, of the Watergate burglars. And it's interesting because the booking officer was starting to write the first couple of names in ink, and then you'll see they were written in pencil because they were like, okay, this is not the real, I'm going to put your name down, Mr. McLean, but this is not the right name for you, is it? Right? You know? So, so we do have the Watergate arrest book, and of course it was 3 2nd District officers who were the ones who were in plain clothes, who pulled up in front of the Watergate in an unmarked car, which is why they were not spotted, or no one alerted the burglars who were in there because they didn't recognize them. And this is one of the beauties of having what we call TAC teams. They're not in uniform, and nobody recognizes who they are. So the other case is, which I think I'm trying to convince the National Law Enforcement Museum, whom I now work for as well, to do a piece and a story, a witness to history on the Hanafi Muslim takeover of 1977. I remember that as a kid. It's one times I remember that the local, and it was probably WRC TV, kind of covered that for 24 hours. It constantly covered. There were cameras on both the B'nai B'rith building, cameras down on the mosque, and cameras at the district building. And a lot of famous things happened in that shooting. First of all, Marion Barry was shot. A security officer was killed. And then you had former then officer Isaac Fullwood, who became chief, who allegedly rescued Marion Barry. I don't think there's any tie to him becoming chief of police, but there's a little bit of lore about that. But the interesting thing about that case, and I mentioned Morris Cullinane, who was at the time of this in '77, he was chief. The FBI did not run that investigation. The Metropolitan Police Department did. The Metropolitan Police Department had help from the State Department, and it was at a time when the Metropolitan Police Department had close to 5,000 officers. Now we're down to 3,500, something like that? 35, 12. Yeah, yeah. And the beauty with those numbers were, of course, we get lots of demonstrations. You need manpower to do that. You had, and Chief Cullinane, and I'll never forget him telling me, he goes, I had plenty of people. We were able to cover all 3 sites, and we were able to keep them contained, and then we got the State Department to help us and started negotiating. Now, the negotiation allowed that man, Kalis, who was the leader of this whole thing, to simply go to house arrest and not be incarcerated, but they had to stand trial. And the whole thing, if you're not aware, started over probably one of the worst mass murders in the city's history up on 16th Street. It's still a house owned by, I believe, the same sect up there on 16th Street, and 7 people, including some infants, were killed in a horrible massacre. And when those people were caught by the Metropolitan Police Department, Kalis and his group, a rival sect, the Hanafi Muslims, demanded essentially that they be put to death. One of the other interesting things, I'll remind you, if there was a film that came out, I'm trying to remember the title of it, but it had to do with the Muslim faith. I think the film was, what was it called? Muhammad, Messenger of God, is that right? They actually stopped the showing of that. When this whole thing happened, it was being premiered in D.C., New York, and Philadelphia, and they held off on it. And that was one of the requests that they made. So again, that's sort of D.C.'s first foray into, I don't know if you want to call it international terrorism, but a terrorist act where 3 buildings were simultaneously taken over. Next slide.
While you're on the Watergate slide, would you also mention that you all have the original dispatch recordings of the radio dispatch and all to the Watergate? Don't you all have the original?
Well, I mean, there may be somewhere. I've never heard it. I've read several accounts on speculation as to why that unit was assigned that call or why they took it. But I've never heard the recording.
I think the recording tape, the logging tape, is among your stuff
It could be. I mean, I have copies of tapes. Actually, we have a copy of a tape of the negotiations with Khalis that was recorded during the Hanafi Muslim takeover. And we also have a copy of the radio tapes from when President Reagan was shot at the Washington Hilton, and the radio transmissions of them not going to what they called bungalow, but going to the hospital. And bungalow was the code word for White House. So the House Committee on Assassinations, again, many people may not know this. The Metropolitan Police Department in 1977 was asked as an impartial, professional law enforcement agency to reevaluate all of the evidence in the assassinations of Robert and John F. Kennedy. And so that's Kennedy's shirt, but you see there's a marker there from the Metropolitan Police Department. Congress asked somebody to reprocess and rephotograph all of that evidence in the Metropolitan Police Department, having to go to certain locations where evidence was held, that they wouldn't allow it to leave to process it. Others was given to us to then be, somebody was watching over it as we reprocessed it. So the Metropolitan Police Department prepared a whole new set of reports, photographs, images, and graphs for the House Assassination Committee on those terrible assassinations.
And what were the conclusions?
Only that it, well, actually, one of the technicians who's now deceased, who I talked to, he raised another palm print from Oswald off of the rifle, if you can believe that. I mean, that thing was handled by so many people. I was kind of like, really? But I don't think it changed any of the conclusions vis-a-vis who assassinated the president. But it was more of a representing, and I think, again, I'm sort of speculating on the motive behind the committee, but sort of wanting to have it evaluated by a neutral party and represented. Kodak actually did a big article on it because we were all using Kodak equipment at that point. And I grew up in D.C., as I mentioned, and I distinctly remember Officer Friendly. And I put that up there because we really need to figure out how to get back to that. I'm not talking school resource officers. These were just officers who would come by and let you know that they are not the enemy, that they're there to help you if you have a problem. I remember our officer-friendly program at Horseman Elementary School, and it was very effective because, you know, look at me, right? Next slide, please. So these are the last two slides. I don't know if you've ever read the book about the sting. It was in the 70s. And again, the Metropolitan Police Department can be very innovative. We've done a lot of really unique things. These guys set up a program where they were buying stolen goods. And that got all the thieves to come to these guys, and then we could identify who the burglars were, who the street guys were, who were selling stuff, who the guys breaking into cars were. And they were giving out pretty good money, and the word hit out that there was a little place up in Northeast that was buying this stuff. And the folks were made to believe that this was the Italian mafia. So you see some of the guys, I'm sorry the picture's not a little bigger, but you had guys who were behind the counter kind of doing this fake Benny Boom Bots. Yeah, no problem. All right, yeah, we take care of it. All right. Menudo Knuckles wants to talk to you. Okay, no problem. And there were cameras behind the counter recording all the transactions, and they had trapdoors, and they had men with shotguns in case things went bad. And what they did to close this whole thing down is they invited everybody to a party to meet the Don. And so guys were coming in, they were dressed up, no problem. They got there, and they gave them all a little bit of a different time, so they didn't have a flood. And as soon as they got in there, they got taken down, taken off. Next guy would come in, and they had a secure door so they could wait. They could make sure that, oh, wait, get him out of the way. Okay, next guy, right, welcome. One guy, and again, it's on video, one guy comes in, he's got a handcuff on his wrist. And he leans over the counter, and he's like, yeah, man, I just got out of the 13th precinct. They had me for robbery. Can you do something with this? And so the officer, I mean, he literally, they ran back into the police's hands. The officer looks at it, he goes, yeah, we can take care of that. And he gets arrested again, but he had literally broken out of his handcuffs in the 13th precinct and ran to make this meeting. So anyway, the sting operation, if you go online and look it up, Bob Arscott, who's pictured there, he's also a member of our board. He was the man on the lower right in the red jacket. He ran this whole operation. And they've since done several things like similar to it. People sort of copied it. Last thing I mentioned is that, you know, when I was on, and I'm sure you all remember, every May was the International Monetary Fund demonstrations. And in 2000, which was not the first one, this large group of people who had just been in Seattle, and if you remember the battle in Seattle, we were getting prepared for that. And that week, those 4 days in 2000 were incredible, with K Street being cut off. 23rd and Pennsylvania Avenue. All the areas around there being cut off, massive arrests, marching all over the place. And if you recall, the Post actually gave us high marks for how we handled that. And the Washington Times did a cartoon of Chief Ramsey, Superman landing in the phone booth, and then Chief Ramsey coming out of it. So I really appreciated that, and the IMF demonstrations really tested the Metropolitan Police Department all the time. I mean, not only from manpower, testing your patience, but also your tactics so those people could attend those meetings, because they were very aggressive about trying to interrupt motorcades, trying to figure out what entrances and exits they were using, things like that. So.
Interesting thing about Seattle, when you think everybody remembers where you were, that watershed moment of 9/11, but Chief, we were actually preparing for protests in D.C., and Chief Ramsey had directed under Mayor Williams, who saved our city and started the Police Foundation and brought baseball, so many things I'm thankful to him for. But we were preparing that day, on the morning of 9/11 was the day we opened our command center on the 5th floor headquarters. So as serendipity would have it, divine intervention, I was a lieutenant at the time in Operations Command on the 5th floor, we had the people in the right chairs to handle an incident.
Yeah.
So it was, as crazy as it was, we had the different DC agencies and military agencies, which was almost scary when you think about hearing live time about planes potentially being shot down and civilian casualties on the ground. But Ramsey was a great mind for DC Police Department, and we have him to thank for our command centers.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So there's lots more. I could probably give you more stories. I think this is my last slide, but I just wanted to give everyone a flavor for the history of your police department. We've been here since 1861, and like every organization, we have our warts, right? We got to hammer a few nails back in every once in a while, but we have a tremendous cadre of people, and I meet people like Pat on the police department all the time. So I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you, gentlemen, both, for your incredibly interesting presentation. Now we have time for a few questions, and let's keep them brief, and let us try and avoid some of the more sensitive policy issues on which we may or may not have our own opinions. So, questions. First question.
Tom, I think we have one online here from Joseph Ackers, if we could get one coming from Zoom.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Fine. I was doing some of my genealogical research, and it kind of led me to the DC Police memorial pages, and took us back to the date of February 26 in 1921. And there was a gentleman that had been released from St. Elizabeth's Hospital. 6 days after his release, he went and purchased a gun, and then he goes on a shooting spree in Washington. He ends up shooting two people. Police officers give chase. They corner him in a house, and he shoots and kills Officer Samuel C. Hayden. The first person that was shot is a distant cousin of mine, Herbert Carl Akers. And Herbert, as a result of the death of Officer Hayden, joined the U.S. Marshal Service and was stationed right here in D.C. And, I just really appreciate the DC Police Memorial for having that information online where we were able to find it.
Okay.
No, thanks for sharing, Joe. That reminds me of another question for you guys, though. I just want to throw this out there. U.S. District Court, which is right next to police headquarters, a lot of history there, too. There's a famous cell that we maintain, the Marshal Service maintains down below. What's this cell called? Or what person or infamous person is it named after? Not Booth. Little later.
Okay, another question.
Does MPD, I know this is more federal investigations, but does MPD have any artifacts from the Letelier assassination on Sheridan Circle and from the Riggs Bank investigation of all the money laundering for Pinochet and his cronies?
If you're referring to the car bomb, yeah, right. There were a couple of them, actually, in D.C., but one went off in that assassination. I'm not aware of us having any evidence or even any documents. I'm sure they're police reports, but that would be the extent of it. And then as far as the other matter, no, we wouldn't have anything to do with the Riggs Bank investigation, nothing like that. We do have a lot of information on the Air Florida crash. And if you have not visited the National Law Enforcement Museum, which again I also work for, don't worry, I separate church and state, the helicopter, if you remember that video, that rescued those people, and those pilots who put the skids of the helicopter in the water to get that last victim out is hanging in the National Law Enforcement Memorial. Yeah, it was.
There's,
When I came to Washington, there was a police academy. But a few years ago, I was down in Greenbrier, West Virginia, and I was told if you could see beyond those trees, you would see the military and the police training together. And that was very troublesome to me because I had the feeling that if the police come out of this kind of training, the public is their enemy. So do you see any difference in the way the police are coming out?
So, yeah, I can take that too. There's a big distinction when we think about law enforcement. It's in the conversation nationally that talks about guardians versus warriors. Military, you're warriors, right? You're trained to be in combat. The majority, 99.99% of police work is a guardian. We take care of the people. Back to Sir Robert Peel, the police are the people are the police. We protect those people. So it's really important to draw that distinction. Now, as far as training goes, as I talked about with the escalation of guns, we have to train more. So we do train. You remember in 2013, we had 11 people killed at the Washington Navy Yard. So it's important to have relationships with military to know how to respond, who's armed in military installations or who's not. And that presents some complexities. I think there were 77 recommendations we took out of that. But we do train, not so much with the military, we train very heavily with DC Fire and EMS. Our training academies at 4655 Blue Plains Drive Southwest, which is right next to the Fire Academy. So to give you an example of how we train now, we've recently built, which we opened in 2013, a tactical training center. So we can simulate school buildings, DC public housing projects, a DC jail, streetscapes, all with catwalk around enclosed so we can train 24/7. So, for instance, if there was an active shooter that happened in Washington, D.C. at a school on New Hampshire Avenue, D.C. police, as training has changed from Columbine to this ubiquitous number of active shooters in the country, the police are now trained to not wait for a SWAT team, but if it's Nick and I get the call and we're 2D patrol, we're going in. And our job is not to take care of the 13 kids that were shot. We go directly to the bad guy and try to take out the bad guy. Wherein now we're training with fire. We call it Rescue Task Force under Chief Donnelly, who was formerly Homeland Security Chief when I was at MPD. They would come in into a warm zone and treat the wounded and do triage. So we do a lot of training with other agencies, but not so much the military. And once again, it's really maintaining that guardian mindset that we protect the public.
When is the museum forecasted to open?
So for the DC Police, we are going to be moving into, I'm sorry, yeah. I thought my voice was loud enough. We have dedicated space in the new building on 441, and by 2023, I'm told we can move into that space. We already have new storage space for our archival material, all of the ephemera and uniforms, and we we even have, I mentioned the police motorcycle with a sidecar, which we're holding on to. And if you know cops, there are a lot of cops who do a lot of their own preservation, and they restore police cars. And, during Police Week that's coming up in May, if you happen to go down on May 15th by the Capitol, you will see an array of privately owned, all restored by guys who, love the job and know that that car is supposed to be a good symbol, restore these cars and keep them. And so we have several MPD guys, current and retired, who've restored cars as well to sort of